It's time for the Gardening Simplified podcast, YouTube, and radio show, coming to you from Studio A here at Proven Winners Color Choice Shrubs. It's Stacy Hervella, me, Rick Vuyst, and our engineer and producer, Adriana Robinson. Well, Stacy, the Garden of Regrets. Your home's garden, landscape, lawn does not come with a warning label. Man, it doesn't come with an owner's manual. Not that you'd read the owner's manual, but it doesn't for that matter. And, you know, when you think about warning labels, you ever read the warning label they put on Christmas lights? For indoor or outdoor use only. What other use would there be, right? And I took my grandson to the playground the other day, and there was a warning on the playground equipment. It said, warning, physical activity carries inherent risks. What? You know, I remember the merry-go-rounds when we were kids in the 70s, and you'd always have the daredevil who'd spin it as fast as he could, right?
Oh, yeah.
And see who could go flying off, or those giant metal slides where by 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the surface of that slide is like 325 degrees. But anyhow, warning labels or regrets, you know, we have, it's a touchy subject. We have motivational speakers that key in on regrets. You know, I've heard them say the pain of discipline or the pain of regret. The difference is discipline weighs ounces while regret weighs tons. And then on the other hand, we have motivational speakers who say to us, well, the biggest regret of your life won't be what you did, but rather what you didn't do. Right?
That's probably true.
Yeah. So
I don't know how that applies to the garden necessarily, but in life, that is probably true. But like, you know, you could see a great plant on sale or at a garden center that you don't usually see and just be like, I don't know where I would put it. Although I don't know what gardener in their right mind doesn't buy something because they don't know where they put it. Maybe a tree, but you know.
So let's tee up some regrets. And as a matter of fact, that's right first on my list. Impulsive plant buying and placement, spacing, improper spacing, or putting a plant in the wrong location. That's got to be one of the top regrets of gardening.
Oh, yeah, but that's also just part of gardening. And most of the time, you don't have to regret that. If you put something in the wrong spot, it's not doing well, or maybe it's doing too well. You can usually move it and correct that. So that's like where the learning happens in gardening.
You've got it. From your mistakes, trying to do too much at once, pacing, making your garden too big. Here's a garden regret that I hear often, and that is listening to a neighbor or a relative.
Oh, I guess it depends on your neighbor or relative.
Well, I had an individual, as a matter of fact, on next week's show, we're going to talk about dogscaping. And I had an individual who said to me that his neighbor told him because the dog was tearing up the lawn, why don't you just plant all crabgrass?
What?
Yes. So there you go.
Oof.
And of course, tied into that in garden regrets is believing everything you see and read on the internet. Don't do that. Not correcting slope and drainage prior to planting, and the same can be said for soil preparation. I think one of the keys to gardening is good soil preparation and understanding your soil. And if you're in a hurry to stick that plant in the ground and you don't create a good foundation, Stacy, you're going to regret it later.
Yeah, usually you will, and it will show up quick.
Planting too close to a structure, not taking into account its eventual size. And coming up on today's show in segment 4, we're going to ask Rick Vuyst, not this Rick Vuyst, my son Rick Vuyst, who is an arborist. But Stacy, we see that with trees all the time where they're just planted too close to a structure. And after 10 or 20 years, you've got a problem on your hands.
You know, it absolutely is a problem. But even though it's bad, I can't blame people for doing this,
right?
Because it is so impossible, even to me as a horticulturist, to believe that little, 5-gallon sapling that you have in your hands legitimately should be planted 60 feet from your house.
Right.
Like you put that little thing out there and it's lost and it's sad, and you just have to be thinking to yourself, surely I could not, this is not going to end up being, 60 feet wide. And it can be very hard to live. I mean, I think people do that even with something not trees like hydrangeas. Right. Big leaf hydrangeas, it's very common for people to buy little cute 1-gallon oh, it's so adorable. It says it's going to be 5 feet. Pff, that's not going to happen. And then they put it right under their dining room window. And next thing you know, disaster.
You got it. Or preparing for weather conditions, whether it be frost or, hey, folks, in some parts of the country, hail netting is a thing.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah, where you plant in spring, and they frequently would get hail in spring, and then there go all your vegetable plants. Of course, plants, putting plants in the ground that are a commitment. Sometimes it becomes a regret, like lily of the valley or violets or English ivy or Norway maple is a perfect example. Boy, does that tree seed like crazy. It's not a great maple tree, although I think Stradivari used Norway maple on the backs of the Stradivarius violins.
Still not a good enough reason to plant it, in my opinion. I mean, it provides shade, but it does literally nothing else. It doesn't really have nice flowers. It doesn't have good full color. It's not really like great for pollinators.
Oh yeah, I agree.
You can do so much better.
I'd add black walnuts to the list, and of course ornamental pears, and some people would even argue nasturtiums, because once you plant nasturtiums in your garden, well, you're going to have nasturtiums everywhere.
Oh, that's a problem I wish I had.
Water sources for your plants. So putting plants in the ground and not paying attention to a water source. And here's a garden regret that I really like, and that is planning to use the fruits of your labor. In other words, eyes bigger than your stomach. Your goals are too lofty. And I'm primarily talking about vegetable gardening when tomatoes and zucchini are in abundance in August, or cucumbers. And now what do I do with this stuff?
I have a friend who fits that description to a T. In March, she was so excited to plant her seedlings. She kept saying, should I do it already? Can I do it now? Can I do it now? And I was like, it would be better if you waited. And, she's all excited to get out into the garden and plant everything. And I know coming up in a couple of weeks here, she's going to be, please take some tomatoes, please. Pepper, zucchini, anything.
That's what I do. I fill a bag, put it on the neighbor's front porch, ring the doorbell, and run. Now, initial planting, as opposed to set it and forget it. In other words, if you're excited about planting an area, let's say you do some tilling, you may be bringing weed seeds up to the surface, or let's talk about quackgrass. My word, with quackgrass, you go through there and till, you're going to be propagating the plant. Maybe it's horsetail. So making sure to take care of the vegetation that's in that area first, and making sure it's taken care of well before you get in there and plant, because you're going to have regret if you don't.
Yeah, I actually have a mailbag question along those lines if we have time to get to it. It should be very interesting.
All right. Providing protection for susceptible plants as far as deer or rabbit damage is concerned. Putting off what you can do now and forgetting to do it later.
Yeah, I do that a lot. Mm-hmm. A lot.
Here in the Midwest or in the North, if you've got a young tree, we were talking about saplings, if you have a young tree and just, not putting the wrap on the trunk in October, and then having Southwest disease flare up where the bark expands and contracts during the winter, and then you have the splitting of that bark. It's going to be there for good. It's going to remind you over and over again that you procrastinated. Not going to kill the tree, but again, that's one of those things that belongs in the garden of regrets.
Well, and along those same lines, a huge regret in my area that sometimes happens, and it's heartbreaking to see, is buckrub. So, if you have a young sapling in fall, the bucks go out there and they try to rub all the velvet off of their antlers and they specifically target young trees. So they have to be like, a certain caliber, certain diameter. And boy, when you see one of those trees, they absolutely destroy it. And it's just a simple thing. Whereas if you had just put like a little one of those like kind of drainage tiles or something around it, they can't access it. And that's an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure in that case.
There you go. I want to add to the garden of regrets to something that I've seen through the years. I have a neighbor across the street. His yard is immaculate. His garage is so clean you could eat off the floor. I mean, everything is in place. He was insistent on using stone mulch. I am not a fan of stone mulch. I like shredded mulches. I don't think stone mulches are good for plants. And then, you start to have weeds grow up through it, whatever it may be. Stone mulch drives me crazy. I told him not to do it. He did it. Now he's regretting.
Oh, well, he better shell out if he's going to want it taken away, because that is not an inexpensive task to ask someone to rake up all your gravel mulch and haul it away. Yikes.
Send us your notes, your emails, your comments, your questions at gardeningsimplifiedonair.com. And, well, share with us some of your garden regrets. We'd love to hear from you. Let's find out what Stacy's going to talk about during Plants on Trial and how she'll tie this into garden regrets. That's coming up next here on the Gardening Simplified Show.
Greetings, gardening friends, and welcome back to the Gardening Simplified Show, where the topic of the day is regrets. Regrets in the garden, regretting doing things, regretting not doing things. And, if I was thinking, what is my biggest garden regret? And, on a small scale, it would be the time that when I was first gardening, and I pruned all my lavender back to the ground in spring, thinking, oh, this looks awful. And I killed all my lavender. And that was a regret. But at the same time, I've never forgotten that lesson. And I have never since pruned lavender incorrectly again. So,
wow.
That's so regret can serve a purpose. But, recently, if I have a substantial garden regret, it is not removing my lawn sooner. So, I've talked a little bit. I've talked a little bit this year, here and there, about the fact that I did have my lawn removed. They brought out a sod cutter, graded it all out, covered everything in shredded bark mulch for the time being to buy time. But eventually, we'll be, building a series of beds in different garden rooms and interconnecting them with paths. And my garden looks so much better without my lawn. Now, to be fair, my lawn looked ghastly. It was not a nice lawn. So it's not like I took out this beautiful lush green carpet and said, bye. It was a very sad lawn. And everything looks just so much better with the mulch. It's a lot easier to care for. And it's just kind of reinvigorated my whole garden. Now,
I like that.
That said, I also am the kind of person who, wants to think long and hard about the decisions that I make in the garden. And sometimes you're not ready to commit. So I'm not sure I could have committed to it sooner. But now once you've done it, you're kind of like, oh, should have done this years ago.
Well, through the years working with people, I've learned that one of the regrets is FOMO, fear of missing out. And fear of missing out on plant bargains and that sort of thing. But the other regret that I see often is going with the smaller planter, not getting a big enough pot that you put that's a big regret.
Yeah, for sure. It's kind of like Julia Child said, you can never really start with too small of a bowl.
There you go. I like that.
Same kind of thing. You might regret how much soil you need to buy to fill it,
right.
But you will be glad you have the larger container in the long run. And, similarly, along the same lines, if we're talking containers, if you see a container that you like at a good price, buy it.
Yes.
You will not see it again.
Yes.
This is not something you can just go online and shop for and expect to find. It's not like they have, model numbers necessarily. They're easy to find. So
grab it.
If you love a container, you deserve it. You should buy it.
Buy it.
So when I was thinking about today's Plant on Trial, again, as usual, lots of directions that I could go. But I had to pick a plant that I would say I consistently hear about the most regret from gardeners. Now, they don't regret planting it necessarily, but they regret the things that they have done. They regret maybe where they planted it. And they almost certainly regret pruning it. And that plant is Hydrangea macrophylla, the good old big leaf hydrangea.
If I had a dime for every time I heard that,
yes,
I'd be a rich man.
And, people have such good intentions when they go into planting a Hydrangea macrophylla or a big leaf hydrangea. They love them. They're just such the epitome of summer. And they have these dreams of big, blousy blue orbs in the garden, and they're psyched and they're excited. But then they, go to the garden center and, as I was explaining, they might get this cute little 1 gallon and look at the tag and say, 5 feet wide. surely I don't need to plant this appropriately. It's never going to get that big, but it does. So very often people plant them improperly.
Absolutely. And don't call me Shirley.
Especially the older varieties. So newer varieties tend to be much, much more compact. But older varieties, if you're looking for any of the like really old antique varieties, Nico Blue, all of those, I mean, those can easily, if they have abundant water and good growing conditions, they can reach 6 feet tall or more. And that obviously can cause a sighting problem. And then, of course, the other regret with big leaf hydrangeas is pruning. Because, you know, for all of their great qualities, when winter rolls around and a big leaf hydrangea loses its leaves, it just looks like it should be cut back. There is just no denying it. It's like a cosmic joke or something. They just look dead and they look like they should be cut back. But if you fall for that trick and you cut your hydrangea back in fall or winter or early spring, well, you've cut off all the flower buds that it was already made for that summer. So you regret pruning it. Now, hopefully, most people do learn that lesson. But a lot of times what happens is maybe the person who planted it learned their lesson. But there is always a well-intentioned child home from college or landscaper or spouse or whatever that comes along and cuts it back.
It's a big fight between couples. I can't candy coat this. It is.
Yeah, nothing makes me shake more than getting a note from someone that says, please settle an argument between my spouse and I.
All the time.
No, please don't bring me into it. And then, of course, the third potential regret with planting a big leaf hydrangea is planting a big leaf hydrangea that was developed primarily for the way it looks and not the way it performs. Yeah. And, you know, here at Proven Winners Color Choice, we have really been laser focused on hydrangea performance. You know, to us, I think the pretty is a given. You could walk around in our hydrangea trials, and I don't think that there might be some that maybe aren't to someone's taste, but they're all pretty because they all have these great qualities that people like: the glossy foliage, those big blousy flowers, bright colors. But we don't just look and say, hey, that's a pretty hydrangea, let's introduce it. We're really focused on improving performance because we know how much regrets that people have when it comes to planting big leaf hydrangeas. So what we've done with recent introductions to our Let's Dance series, and today's plant on trial is Let's Dance Ariba hydrangea. What we've done with this series is we have pinpointed two main features that we are specifically selecting plants for that make a big difference in how it performs. The first one is we're looking for big leaf hydrangeas that set their flower buds along the entire length of their stem. So before, older varieties of big leaf hydrangea, they only set them at the top bud. And these newer ones that we're looking at, they set them along the entire length of the stem. So what that means is in those old varieties, if they lost that top bud, there go your flowers. You got nothing for the following summer. With these, if they accidentally get cut back, which they should not, but if they do, they'll still flower. If they get killed back by winter, they'll still flower. If they get browsed by deer, they still have flower buds lower down on the plant to bloom on old wood. And then because a reblooming hydrangea also blooms on new wood, we've focused on the amount of time it takes these plants to develop those new wood blooms. And we're trying to get that down to a smaller time period. Now, typically older reblooming hydrangeas need to create 6 sets of leaves before they can set a new wood flower. And it takes a long time, especially in a cooler climate like ours. So we're trying to get that down. Can it set fewer? Can it set it with shorter internodes so it doesn't have to make as much growth as those older varieties? So our recent introductions into the Let's Dance series, Let's Dance Skyview and Let's Dance Can Do exhibit this characteristic, but those have already been plants on trial. So I'm going with the third one that has these amazing characteristics, and that is a Let's Dance Ariba big leaf hydrangea, reblooming big leaf hydrangea.
You know, genetics and development and all the work that is put into this, it's amazing to me, Stacey.
It is. And, you know, it's taken us so many years to not just be able to identify that some hydrangeas have this feature and what a difference it makes, but to gradually transition our breeding material that we're using to create these plants to plants that have that primarily, so that more of our offspring will have that, and then we keep developing that to be a better and better and more prominent trait among the plants. So, all of the plants, the 3 Let's Dance that have this this trait are all hardy to USDA Zone 4. And it's not just that they will live in USDA Zone 4. All 3 of these will bloom in USDA Zone 4, which is a huge change compared to older ones. But what's different about Let's Dance Ariba than the other 2, and we'll link to all of them, of course, in the show notes at gardeningsimplifiedonair.com, is the color. So, a lot of people, when it comes to hydrangea color, they have some awareness that the soil needs to be acidic, and maybe they also know that it needs to contain aluminum for a hydrangea to be blue or purple. But that's not all of the equation. A hydrangea's flower color is primarily determined by the genetics of the plant itself, by the inherent ability of the plant to be a certain color. And Let's Dance Ariba is one of those that just has that bright, bold gene. And so when you see Let's Dance Ariba in the garden, it's just like a beacon. It has just like a deep raspberry red color if you are in alkaline soil or soil without aluminum. And if you are in soil with aluminum and or acidic soil, you're going to get a purple.
I've noticed that in the garden center, Stacy. Of course, I help out in a garden center, or when I'm out on the road, if I run across a garden center, I can't help it. The car just veers in there and I walk around. But I'm amazed at how Ariba looks in the pot.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it's a beautiful plant.
It really is. It's one of those plants that if you see it, you just have to have it. You will not regret buying it either, because it will actually perform for you. Now, a lot of people mistakenly think that purple color develops if you're just right in between acidic and alkaline. That's not true. Purple is actually a genetic trait. And Let's Dance Ariba is one of those that if you like a purple rather than a blue, it's a great plant. Now, I could go on and on talking about hydrangeas. I love talking about hydrangeas. It's hydrangea season, but we almost have to take a break. Again, this is Let's Dance Ariba hydrangea, hardy to USDA Zone 4, 2 to 3 feet tall and wide, so you don't need to worry about it overgrowing your dining room windows and regretting where you placed it. So if you've been disappointed by hydrangeas, if you have hydrangea regrets, I hope that you will try Let's Dance Ariba, Let's Dance Skyview, or Let's Dance Can Do. They all have these great features that we hope will end hydrangea regret for good. We're going to take a little break. When we come back, we're opening up the garden mailbag, so please stay tuned. Greetings, gardening friends, and welcome back to the Gardening Simplified Show, where it's time for us to answer your gardening questions. If you have a gardening question for us to answer, you can reach us at help, H-E-L-P, at gardeningsimplifiedonair.com, or just visit gardeningsimplifiedonair.com. We got a contact form there. We make it real easy. You can even attach a photo. And, the order of the day is garden regrets. And I heard from Patty, who definitely does not have any regrets. She sent a photo of a beautiful combination of Proven Winners annuals that she created. And she just wanted to say this combination of Blew My Mind Evolvulus, White Lantana, and Whirlwind Scaevola Purple is one of my absolute favorites. And it is a great combination.
Oh, I looked at the photo. Gorgeous. And for folks who are watching on YouTube, you can see a picture of Patty's planter there. That is fabulous.
Yeah. And, I wouldn't have thought to put the blue and purple together, but it really works. And I love Blew My Mind Evolvulus. I think it's a neat plant, but I have regretted planting it before because, well, I'll tell you why.
Okay.
It's a reason it's a great plant. I do like it, but the flowers close really early in the afternoon. So as a person with a full-time job, I regret having a plant that I can only enjoy 2 days a week. And after that, the buds close up. So a great plant, but definitely one for those who can enjoy it during the day when the flowers are open. So please do visit gardeningsimplifiedonair.com and check out Patty's amazing planter. We had a question from North.
Yeah, North says, as you probably know, it's hot and dry out here in Denver. Some of our tomato plants are curling on the ends of the leaves. Now, the curling is progressing and even bunching up. According to Google, that is probably from heat stress and lack of water. At first, I thought it looked like aphids, so I sprayed, but it's still curling. On Google, I found heat stress and possibly fungus, so I sprayed for that. Now I'm wondering if something else is going on. Do you have some thoughts? And as a matter of fact, what I did with this one, Stacy, was I reached out to North. because I wanted to know more details. Was he planting in a container or was he planting in the ground? Well, he was planting in the ground. I think the issue here is more physiological. In other words, the soil, the heat stress, how dry it is there in Denver, and the plant is showing the effects of that. As a matter of fact, I mentioned to North that when in the future, when he plants the tomatoes, to deep plant them along the stem, giving a larger root mass so that when it gets hot and dry, it's easier to care for tomato plants. Also, he's feeding with a water-soluble fertilizer, and I'm just not a big fan of water-soluble fertilizers with tomatoes because they're here today, gone tomato. But rather dry feeds like the Espoma tomato tone, which have micronutrients in them as well as the macronutrients. So that's kind of my feeling on North's dilemma.
Right. I think people do, when they see curling leaves, they kind of freak out and they're like, oh, something's wrong. It's got a disease. It's got a pest. But especially, I would say 9 times out of 10, it's almost certainly a cultural issue. It's something about where and how the plant is growing. And anytime you see a plant leaf curling, and there's not an obvious sign of an insect like in the hydrangea leaf tire or something like that, what's typically happening is that the plant is trying to reduce the amount of leaf surface that's exposed to the sun. And by curling that leaf inward, not only is it reducing the amount of leaf surface that's exposed to the sun, but it's hiding the stomata on the underside of the leaves, so it's transpiring less or losing less water. Now, of course, in Denver, mile high city, very high altitude, so that sun is much, much more intense. Now, North might not have been growing tomatoes for years and is only seeing this for the first time. It could be variety dependent.
Yep.
It could be due to, just where it was and making the transition from the greenhouse to, where it's planted now in your yard. There's a lot of reasons, but I would say as long as the growth is healthy, it's continuing to put out a lot of new growth and flowering and fruiting well, I would just chalk this up to a cultural condition and not really worry about it.
Yeah, you make a great point, Stacy. A plant that I think of is weeping fig, the house plant, and how that midrib down the center of the foliage is so dominant when the plant is shipped out of Florida because it gets hot and sunny in Florida, and that foliage can fold on itself. We bring it up north into homes in Minnesota or Michigan, and they're getting not much light. That midrib almost goes away. So a plant's ability to curl or fold on itself due to heat is certainly a factor. Trixie writes to us, please help. This is a 3-year-old summerific French vanilla. Oh, you love summer.
I love my summerific hibiscus.
So we're asking the right person. I thought it was dead. I had lost all hope. I'm in south central Texas. That's hot. The first year it flowered but didn't grow much. The second year it grew some and flowered a lot, but at the end of the season it seemed like it was struggling. She's given it her best efforts, but summer arrives in mid-April, and by May 1, everybody is usually awake and growing in her garden. But check this baby maybe 3 weeks ago, no signs of life. Yesterday I saw her looking sickly but growing. Basically, Trixie wants to know, what do I do with this summerific French vanilla?
Right. So it's kind of a crazy situation. I had to do a double take on the date that Trixie sent this because, we've talked about it before that the summerific hibiscus are one of the last, if not the last perennial to start to show signs of life in spring. But in Texas, for it to not show any signs of life until late June is wild.
Yeah, that's wild.
That is totally out of character for this plant. And, what exactly is happening, I don't know. I actually didn't think that the growth looked all that unhealthy. It definitely looks like it's trying. And hibiscus have really nice, big, kind of tuberous roots, so they can store a lot of energy in those that they can use to try to emerge again. So, Trixie, I don't know, these are water-loving plants. I can get away with them being fairly dry here in Michigan because our summers aren't nearly as hot as they are there. So I don't know if this is an issue of the plant simply needing more water. That very well could be. So what I would recommend that you do is I would recommend you fertilize it. So you can just use, whatever you have, like a Espoma garden tone or anything like that would be fine. I would fertilize it I would fertilize it now and then maybe twice more over the season and water that in well and keep an eye on the watering. And I think that what should happen is that should build it back up so that it's more, happy. overall, they're pretty pest-free plants. So I think this is, again, more like a lot of what North was dealing with, just a cultural issue.
Yeah, they like lots of sunshine and that moist, well-drained soil. You're right. They are water users, no question.
Oh, and she also asks, how do I get rid of this evil Bermuda grass, which I thought was a good subject to address quickly here on our regrets show, because a lot of people who have planted Bermuda grass have gone on to regret it. It's not really a warm climate grass. It's definitely more of a cool, it is a warm climate grass. Right. Excuse me, I misspoke. It's not really a cool climate grass, but it grows really, really tight to the ground, and it puts out these little runners that is nearly impossible to manage once it's established. But interestingly, if this is a possibility for you, Trixie, here is an interesting way to manage it. Research has shown that if you interplant it with tall fescue, so this fall, go ahead and plant tall fescue grass seed along with it, just overseed it, and you mow it for a year at 4 inches tall, that the Bermuda grass hates shade so much that the 4-inch fescue will actually shade it out and completely get rid of the Bermuda grass.
That's a great idea. And tall fescue is drought tolerant, and it is traffic tolerant, and it's that solution is very similar to simply raising the deck on your mower and giving grass a competitive edge against weeds.
So, if there's other places that if it's like going into your beds or whatever, try using shade as a technique, because it cannot live without full sun. And apparently that is an effective way to manage it, much more so than herbicides.
Fantastic. And Stacy Lindsay writes to us, we've got 14 very well-established incredible hydrangeas flanking the front of the home, and they love them, the neighbors love them, but they're struggling with bindweed.
Yes. And oh my gosh, when Lindsay sent this photo, I opened it and I just gasped. Her hydrangeas are so beautiful and so beautifully sited in front of her house. But yeah, bindweed, a terrible weed, extremely aggressive. And she goes on to say that she had bindweed really well established in a perennial bed, and she just dug up all the perennials and spent a couple days rigorously going through the soil and taking out all of the bindweed roots. Not a fun job, but she said that did work, and she's wondering if she could do it for the hydrangeas. And I would say absolutely, Lindsay. In fact, that would be my specific recommendation. Since bindweed is a vine, it's growing all up through the hydrangeas. She can't use an herbicide even if she's willing to, because there's no way to just spray the bindweed without getting it on the hydrangeas as well. So yeah, I think that digging up the hydrangeas and spending time to just completely rid that bed of the bindweed is the best solution. I have used a solution like that similarly myself, but what I would recommend is that you wait until late winter, early spring to do this, and you do it when the hydrangeas are dormant.
And be thorough in getting the roots out, because bindweed is so aggressive and truly has an extensive root system.
Yeah, a very, very extensive root system. And so it sounds like she's got experience with it. She says, she recognizes the roots are very distinctive and easy to identify, which is a good thing. So yeah, what I would say is definitely look for early spring. And the nice thing about doing big jobs like this in early spring is you're really itching to get out in the garden. You have an energy that you might not have come late July. And so it can be a very satisfying job after a long winter. But Lindsay, I would say by all means, go ahead and do it. I don't think that the hydrangeas will be any worse for this project by digging them and replanting them. It's a tough plant, and they will be just fine. If you have a question for us, you can reach us at gardeningsimplifiedonair.com. We're going to take a little break, and when we come back, we've got Rick Vuyst, the other Rick Vuyst. So please stay tuned.
Welcome back to the Gardening Simplified Show. It's time for branching news. And Stacy, a few weeks ago, we had a listener send us a picture of a tree that was thinning and dying at the top. And we've seen these pictures before and seen that happen out in the landscape. And, we were wondering, boy, when a tree reaches that point, is there anything that you can do at that point? Yeah. And what we decided to do was to bring in an expert, an arborist, and so we thought we'd bring in Rick Vuyst. Not this Rick Vuyst, my son, Rick Vuyst. Rick is an arborist with Good Earth tree care. And as a matter of fact, Rick had shared with me some video that they shot while they were using an air spade and working on the roots of a tree that they were trying to save. Rick, it's great to have you here on the Gardening Simplified show.
Good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks so much. So for folks who are watching the program on YouTube, you'll be able to see this video that Rick provided. But Rick, tell us a little bit about this tree that you were called on to try to save due to girdling roots and problems with the roots at the base of the tree.
A short answer to that, or a quick thought on that, is that really there's two different issues. And we did a root collar excavation, and we found only a few larger girdling roots that we actually did not cut off.
Okay.
But exposing that part of a tree, every tree has a dotted line, an imaginary line, made to be above ground, made to be below ground, and then there's a transition period called the buttress roots. And we want the buttress roots to be exposed to oxygen,
Sure.
not under soil. So if a different tree has really bad girdling roots and the top of the tree is dying like you talked about, that is something that just today and yesterday I had the conversation with someone about where it's not on their radar. Most people don't stare at the top of the tree. Their eyes gravitate low. But the first thing I do is look at the base of the tree and then the top of the tree. Those are the two most important parts to me. And if the top is dying, that's definitely a sign of girdling roots. And if a tree's small enough, you can do surgery, probably over multiple years, and remove the girdling roots. But often by the time I get a call, if a normal person, a homeowner, non-arborist, notices that it doesn't look so good, you're probably
it's too late.
Yeah, probably.
So how long after a tree is planted can it start showing these signs? I mean, is it 5 years? Is it 15 years? Does it vary by the species or in the growing environment?
Definitely varies by species. There's a particular species around here that it's incredibly common. Not in the woods, only in urban areas where humans are planting the trees.
And which one's that?
Nature does a good job. Maples.
Okay.
And most of them are also hybrid natives, and some of those are invasive. So, but that's like the most common problem that I see with maple trees is girdling roots. And most humans don't realize that there's a place that they're supposed to put it at ground level, and they just throw it in the ground. And sometimes I'm in a backyard and I say, oh, somebody got lucky, 40 years ago. That tree, it's definitely planted by a human, but it's got good root flare.
So root flare, describe root flare to us. What is it you look for?
Well, I'll often point out to someone, even from a distance when we're looking at a tree, I'll say, you notice how that tree is a cylinder going into the ground? And then I'll look around and point out probably a tree in a wood line that's not planted by a human, and see how that flares out, the trunk flares out before it goes into the ground. Those are the buttress roots. That's great. That's what we want to see. Your cylinder, that's not what I want to see.
Sure.
Right.
So, kind of going back to what you talked about with how long does it take for them, that's a big issue because, again, people don't make the phone call. If I can hop in the DeLorean and go back in time, I can fix it for you, but I can't. So it's over.
Right.
And so there's people where if I've gained their trust and I say, give me $200 and I'll fix that $750 planting that those people, the landscapers did for you. I'm not trying to dog them, but it's wrong.
Sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sure.
And it was probably the damage is usually done by the growers. Wholesalers, the guys that have the assembly line, that's where it starts. And then that tree gets repotted multiple times and then planted in the ground by a human again.
So tell us about air spading.
So this particular project was more of a root collar excavation, expose it, and then we used the air spade sort of like a rototiller is the way you could think of it, where we rototill the soil, we add compost, nice rich black dirt, and then do it again and mix it in. And then after that, I recommend watering, like soaking with a sprinkler, and then go back and cover it with, we use organic leaf mulch because that will just turn into yet more compost like a woodland floor. Generally speaking, I try to mimic what the woods is like.
Sure. Sure.
So,
And in this case, this was a tree near a church, and it's a gorgeous tree.
Yep.
And they just they wanted to make sure. I guess I shouldn't use this phrase, but I will. They were going to move heaven and earth to try and save this tree, right?
well, and that's not really true, because this is a win for us. Because
Okay.
I took the initial, well, Mary took the call, put it on my schedule, quote to remove tree. And it's church. The priest isn't out there. I'm looking at it, but I'm thinking this is gorgeous. And I had an idea of when the structure had been built, and I was seeing where they regraded, and I could tell that the trunk was buried. So a client of ours had recommended us to the priest after he had gotten multiple estimates to remove the tree. And Brett and I, the owner of our company, approached them with a different option. How do you feel about pruning it away from the stained glass so that it doesn't break the stained glass, and we'll make the tree healthier and reduce the risk of it breaking?
Sure.
It's a big, gorgeous tree that everybody sees off the highway when you're heading east out of Grand Rapids. So they went with us. So that was a win, not only, even just saving the tree. Not that we got the job. We get a lot of jobs. We don't get a lot of jobs, but this was a good one for us, where you feel it's gratifying when you're finished. Like, all right, we saved you, we made you better.
Yeah, I think a lot of people assume that, an arborist is like the stereotypical, to a guy with a hammer, everything looks like a nail, that they are there in the business of just like, take it out, grind it up. And I think that a lot of people don't realize that arborists, are not so much fond of their chippers as they are of actually being able to save a tree.
Some of us just think differently. I've seen guys that write tree killer on their gloves. Like, come on, man. I mean, just yesterday, there's a guy who had 3 estimates already to remove 2 giant spruce trees. It was probably going to be $4,000 or $5,000. The first thing I responded after he talked to me with was, these are Norway spruce, blah, blah, blah. Gave him the rundown of what they are. They're healthy, no disease, good root flare. I would just prune them away from the house, take 10, 12 branches off. And he's like, nobody else even brought that up. He's like, I didn't know you could do that. And I'm like, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
And so I sent him the estimate and thought, all right, I got a feeling I might have just won that one as well. So,
yeah, saving trees instead of taking them out. How often do you see tree planting regret? In other words, you go out on a job and someone years ago planted it too close to a structure. How often do you see that?
Almost every day, looking at something, I say, that was probably cute when they put it in, but they don't realize that it's going to be a giant.
Yeah,
exactly. And
exactly.
I'll often point out invasive trees or trees you don't want growing out of your foundation, and then I'll look around and say, that's mommy right there. Like, you don't want that growing out of your foundation. So, and that's nature, but that would be a regret of not pulling that when it was small.
Yeah,
exactly.
For sure. Now, I'm sure as an arborist also, you look at the whole issue of monocultures versus diversity. Of course, we experienced that here in the Midwest a few years ago with emerald ash borer, trees that are streets rather that are lined with nothing but ash trees. Emerald ash borer comes along, it becomes a serious problem. I'm sure you experienced that also, where in some areas a lack of diversity creates a problem in and of itself and creates regret.
Yeah, definitely. And that goes for any species.
Yeah.
As you know, many diseases, insects, they're host specific. I often bring up emerald ash borer because everyone's so familiar with it around here. And say they didn't kill any other trees, only the ash. Not all diseases are like that, but a lot are. So diversity is big.
And of course, we're dealing with invasive pests also. For those watching on YouTube, here's a picture of a couple of hemlocks, which I love in my backyard, but I'm losing them due to woolly adelgid. Adelgid was a problem that came into the U.S. years and years ago, but Rick, as these invasive insects or pests or diseases come along, they travel. And that's unfortunate. And we're able to anticipate the problem, and yet there it is on your doorstep.
Yeah. And then finances is what I think, taxes aren't going to take care of that insect and stop it in its tracks. And 1/10 of people are going to pay money to try and save that tree. So there's our trees. Just last week I saw an ash, and then the first thing that pops into my head, if it looks good, I can tell these people, they're not treating it. But I'm like, that was treated in the late 90s, 2000s, even past then. You know, it wasn't long ago, but it is like a swarm. Like you said, it's like a horror film. They come through like a locust plague, and they move on to where there's more food.
You bet. So for our listeners, for folks watching on YouTube or listening on the podcast or radio, Rick, as an arborist, getting into many people's yards, and of course today's show is about garden regrets, what's your best advice for people who are looking to establish trees? Do your research. What are your recommendations? What are the primary mistakes you see being made?
Well, when you get species specific, that's about certain situations. But as far as just general good practices planting, number one is planting depth. Another first thing I say is try to stay native, or at least hybrid native. But even the hybrid natives, there's neighborhoods I can drive you to them where the oak, white oaks, red oaks, white pines, the dominant native forests, every sapling is a maple. And I know it's the ones in the front yards that are in everybody's front yard. So that's the future of that woods. No more oaks. So let's try to stay native, planting depth, soil. Soil. Well, how wide do I dig it? How wide are you willing to go? Because someday the roots on that tree are going to be 50 feet more in a radius around that tree. So soil. And then early years, just like any plant, you know, if it's hot and dry in the summer, water it once a week. Soak it.
You bet. You bet. Well, some of these issues we can avoid if we want to, Stacy. But again, it's all about, and we talk about it on this show, trying to anticipate some of these issues and educating yourself.
Absolutely. Got to do your research.
Absolutely. Rick, thanks for joining us on the Gardening Simplified show. Rick Vuyst is an arborist with Good Earth Tree Care and just happens to be my son also. And thanks for joining us on the show, Rick. Appreciate it.
Yep. Thanks for having me.
Well, I am inspired to plant a tree with no regrets. Now I just have to decide which one it's going to be, and that's the hardest part of all. So thank you so much, Rick. Thank you, Rick. Thank you, Adriana. And thanks so much to all of you for listening. We hope you have a wonderful week ahead.